And we will start with the lecture of Professor Filipe Campello from Federal University from Pernambuco. Professor Filipe will give us the talk, Politics of Passion on the Effective Content of Transnational Public Sphere.
Thank you, also Nitamar and Alessandro Pisani for the invitation and organization of this very nice conference. So my talk is on a part of current work in progress on the relationship between politics and affect. So I would like to explore here how far some political emotions like solidarity could be also grounded in this context. Okay, I would like to start with an episode told by Bertolt Brecht in his Stories of Mr. Kolleg. Brecht says like this: Mr. K did not think it necessary to live in any particular country. He said, I can go hungry anywhere. One day, however, he was walking through a city that was occupied by the enemy of the country in which he was living. An officer came toward him and forced him to step down from the pavement. Mr. K stepped down and realized that he felt outraged at this man, and not only at this man, but especially at the country to which the man belonged. That is, he wanted it to be wiped from the face of the earth. What made me, asked Mr. K, become a nationalist for this 1 minute? It was because I encountered a nationalist. But that's precisely why this stupidity has to be rooted out, because it makes whoever encounters it stupid. So this provocation by Brecht, I think, has to do, and that's somehow what I would like to talk about, the relation between identity and politics. And I would like then to point out what I am calling an affective content on this relation. So we are facing a kind of, I call it an affective turn in some political theory discussions, but it's not so clear how far, on which extent this could be also addressed in this discussion on a transnational public sphere. So it's somehow this is what I'm trying to do here. And well, nationalism, I think different than other identity claims, this concept of nation, as we know it, could be seen as a constructed narrative, to use this famous work of Benedict Anderson. So as an imaginary community. It's not imaginary, I think it's interesting, in the sense of abstract concept, but as an imaginary shared culture. And I would say affects that acquires reality and establishes concrete ties. Even if the nationalism can be viewed as a constructed sentiment, it's one of the most powerful driving force in the sense of a political disposition. I think that is quite clear. And well, alternatively, to try to challenge then this constructed sentiment, we can face mainly two options. Either we can take a normative defense of, let's say, a post-national constellation, a cosmopolitan perspective, mostly also drawing on Kant, or one can indicate how the feeling of belonging to a shared political space can be also grounded in other values. So this transition of some specific territorialities, I think it's much compensated by the attachment to some concrete symbols like flags, hymns, traditional holidays, etc. And when this cultural pluralism increases to a level that breaks with such attachment, then we can see a kind of threat to a common imaginary behind national identities, and this identification narrative of othering. So, or to put this in the Mr. K, like in the Brecht short story, as an enemy. So identify this difference, this as a process of othering. I think that was a very common political strategy. We have seen it also in Trump election, and here also shortly some weeks ago here in Brazil, facing the Venezuelan immigration. So it was quite odd how, because of a famous saying that happened, that a Venezuelan supposedly, allegedly, has stole some Brazilian guy, and then there was a strong reaction against all the Venezuelans. So a kind of identification not only with a personal individual that could be a criminal, but the association between this criminal with this othering, so a wider identity as Venezuelan. And so that was huge, what happened, what we see here in Brazil with this. So my question then is whether this sort of imaginary affect could be replaced by also another kind of constructed sentiment. And alternative normally to this national picture, that concept of solidarity has been proposed so as this fruitful model for, let's say, an enlarged and transnational perspective. And to put it shortly, then my main normative question is that I then would like to discuss is how far is possible, if it's the case at all, to overcome from this basic structure of a national linked patriotic feeling to this solidarity as a transnational political emotion. So I'm facing here this possible, in this broader project, possible connection between theory of institutions and emotions, and more particularly how far an institutional framework can strengthen cooperative and democratic practices. So this kind of emotional content of public sphere and the role of institution in the formation, I think that this formative process, we have discussed this also in some talks, the formation of solidarity as this political emotion. Well, it's very well known that the Habermas appropriation of the concept of constitutional patriotism, that's the first part I would like to address, so how we could challenge nationalism then as these political emotions. And then the Habermas alternative were rooted then on Karl Jaspers and Sternberg, so it's a kind of reaction against exactly this experiences associated with a kind of overwhelming nationalist expression. So after the Second World War. And it's interesting in the beginning, it's pretty well known how this working with the past would be a kind of cosmopolitanism based on the idea of universal membership, or emphasizing precisely the link between remembrance and democratic political culture. So it was a kind of alternative to national picturing, and this kind of attachment that could be play also an important role, rather connect with basic rights expressed in the Constitution. So my intention is not to readdress this concept of constitutional patriotism, but I think it's quite interesting the reading of young Hermann Miller, that precisely was trying to put it in opposition to a more idealistic model. So Miller has also in view this kind of empirical and moral psychological contributions, and he criticized the considerably neglected role of emotions in most of the discussion of both liberal nationalism and constitutional patriotism. And then Miller tries to turn the attention that what could motivate solidarity or make citizens want to support democratic institutions. So his question is, if instead of a kind of tendency of a pause-emotional or kind of supra-emotional, like in the quote, approach, an affect cannot be made to work for democracy at all beyond the national state. So that's, I think it's for my interpretation quite productive. And then in contrast to a kind of defense of liberal nationalism, so this could be viewed as a sort of not as a natural legitimation of heroic national stories or national pride. So Miller sees in constitutional patriotism a kind of mitigated normative connotation, so not this idealistic form, more strongly normative force, expressing rather a normatively dependent concept, drawing on Reiner Force concept. So constitutional patriotism could be understood this way as to promote political stability, or rather civic empowerment, leading also for legitimate forms of even civil disobedience. And then it's a kind of Janus facet, oriented both towards stability and civic empowerment. And so here his conclusion that constitutional patriotism is capable of avoiding the sources of moral danger associated with both liberal nationalism and traditional forms of patriotism. This is its distinctive virtue. It serves both as a source of civic trust and therefore stability, and a source of civic empowerment. I think it's quite productive, this concept, but I have then mainly two problems here. Concretely, in a more, let's say, sociological level, national identity can also reveal a strong tie, I think stronger, even stronger than what is pretended by the constitutional patriotism, which in turn seems to have a rather normative force. And this idea, I think, could be also tricky. So if you take the US context of some constitutions in countries like Latin America, for instance, if you remember the constitution in Chile that was still grounded during the Pinochet regime, it's kind of problematic, the very constitutional basis of patriotism. So I think that is one limit that should be also discussed. But my main problem beyond this one is which framework could be linked also to a kind of emotive dimension of constitutional attachment that could also provide a framework for post-national solidarity. And here, I think Hegel could help with, I think, interesting differentiation between two different models of patriotism. So, the first one, Hegel associates with some kind of negative freedom. That's a radicalization of a kind of individual expression that can destroy all the institutions. And so, for instance, here the idea of fanaticism, that it's well known, the association with the terror period in French Revolution. It's a kind of radicalization of this kind of shape and passion, what Hegel calls it a fury of destruction. So Hegel calls it Massenhaftpatriotism. So that's a word that Hegel uses precisely to criticize actually a fanatic or only a radical negative form of patriotism. So in opposite of this model, Hegel has then another one that's a kind of associated with the political sentiment of this position. And Hegel has in mind here the English patriotism, the English model, that could be then the interest of the citizen in participating in their affairs, in political affairs. So it's a kind of more decentralized idea of patriotism. That this one, that is not the strong nationalist picture, but much more related to a political sentiment, Hegel sees as then productive. The sentiment linked to this is trust. So the citizens can trust the institutions in the extent they feel recognized in their individual interests and rights. It's not so an independent and let's say unequivocal trust in the state, but there are some preconditions precisely to be recognized in their rights. I tried then to propose here these two directions. One could be seen as a vertical one, so this relation between individuals and state, and another would be the horizontal one, so in the idea of public sphere and more broadly social relations, where probably this concept of solidarity takes place, in this then horizontal idea of political disposition. So I think Hegel here then can contribute to put a enlarged idea of political disposition that exactly is not limited to the idea of national state. And here I put a movement from patriotism, and here in my last part of my talk, to transnational solidarity. I think here we have both Habermas and Honneth appropriation of Hegel tries to put some light in what I think is quite interesting to understand what is behind a more formal, either juridical or moral process. So Habermas refers this to the idea of Sittlichkeit, is also drawing on Hegel, saying that I think you have a quotation. Yeah, whereas both solidarity and Sittlichkeit are different than juridical and moral dimensions, solidarity presupposes political contexts of life that are legally organized and in some extent artificial. The problem is precisely that nationalism obscures this difference between solidarity and pre-political Sittlichkeit. Where my main problem with Habermas is that this kind of artificial idea can also not make clear what is precisely is behind this kind of attachment. So what are also these, let's say, political disposition that puts also a kind of what I'm calling here this affective dimension to take part in the public sphere. So what, let's say, in the European Union, as Honneth also talks about, so here in the drawn the Durkheim's concept of organic solidarity, it's exactly trying to understand what we have as a members of a shared public sphere. What does it mean, like, to understand European Union, in this case, as a shared public sphere, or in what extent it can only be formal without the attachment of the citizens. So in my work, I'm trying to understand this kind of normativity that is not only in this, when we talk about in theories of justice, they are probably in a theory of institutions. So when we are kind of thinking about this, I'm calling this, so this institutional normativity, I think has to do with the talk this afternoon. But what is precisely shared in this affective content that enable and justify an enlarged public sphere. And I think here then this formation of a transnational public sphere, it's not only linked to this normative theory, even the concept of constitutional patriotism, but also to the conditions of legitimacy of a discourse that sometimes is not clearly articulated. I think then we have different discussions on occupiers and transnational workers movement that historically has put some immanent grammar to be part of a public sphere that is not only national. I think with this premise, to come to my last point, whereas in this post-national constellation it became even more diffuse towards the sentiment of belonging in this shared public sphere, I think this premise still poses this precondition of what Ness Fraser has called also legitimacy and efficacy of a normative approach on the public sphere. And I think solidarity has its specific importance precisely in its depart from moral and juridical norms, as Habermas put it, but not only in a kind of artificial way, but I would say in a more immanent or organic way. Then in contrast to justice, has not to be justified only on legal terms, but on that extent that the citizens share this common public sphere, or let's say a Sittlich identity. I think then, and I have this part, this identity does not express any rigid or preformed one, but only represents the capacity of a kind of dialectical identification. To recognize others with whom I don't share any fixed value previously established, like color, ethnicity, or nationality. Whereas an enlarged transnational sentiment is more challenging. I think that a shared workspace or worksphere, what you can call here spatiality of affects, can nurture this, let's say, empathic or solidary sentiment with the other. I think, to conclude, then, I'm trying to understand this grammar. I still have 10 minutes. Oh, it's great. I mean, you are right, to conclude. Okay. No, but just the 3 minutes and then I'm finished. How we can understand this immanent grammar? So what is the specificity of this normativity in this, to use also a word, concept important for Monet, a moral grammar. I think then, complementary to an institutional level, I would like to suggest this broader use of the social, incorporating this grammar that provides an important dimension, what I'm calling here education of affects. And education here should not be understood as a kind of paternalist model or vertical, so the institutions that are educating or promoting some particular, even democratic, desirable emotions, so to speak, this way, but in a more immanent formation of these affects. I think, to use the story in the beginning, this fixation of identity, this fixation on the othering, is also a stronger constructed sentiment that is, I would say, per se, it's not criticizable, but we should understand how we can then challenge this kind of formation, where the difference is something not constitutive, but something that should be eliminated or associated with, so this othering as a trouble for our identity. For instance, in the theoretical model I have here, also in view I think it's this formation of affects, like Habermas, but also in more pragmatically way in Richard Horty. So in this expansion of the we, what the difference could be understood, not something to be avoided, but something that is part of the range of the we. So there's this other that we can share, also suffering or vulnerability, to use the word of Judith Butler. So what I'm trying to do here then is avoid this kind of paternalistic approach on one hand, and on the other hand, what I would say here, a psychology. So it's not a kind of normative theory grounded on a theory of affect. So how the institutions here rather would offer an alternative model, so to interpret the role of social institutional practice and open this to a kind of critique. So it's the critique, a kind of critique of affects. All this dimension, I think it's very important to make it clear, also doesn't to be understood to substitute the institutional and juridical consolidation of this process. So I think the problem in Habermas' discussion is also to somehow neglected a process that is not to be fought only in a kind of institutional way, whereas the citizen still doesn't share this sentiment of participating in the public sphere. I think then I work with these 2 dimensions, also both juridical in this sense and this affective that precisely has to do with this grammar. And then what I expect from this articulation between this institutional design, or what I'm calling here affective content, first then, not should encourage this critique of a paternalist model of state, but rather emphasize its formative role according to some criteria here, and then it's the normative dependence, how a moral theory could also evaluate between different kinds of affects. So it's not that affects per se has already a personal in a kind of moral value. So range or let's say fear could or not be moral legitimate. So we need this step back. And second, keeps this flexibility and contextual dynamics of content that should keep open to critique and corrigibility. This outline of what I'm calling the critical theory of affects involves then a formative role inherent to an immanent grammar whose content depends on the dynamism and contextuality of social praxis. And then I have started with a story, and then I conclude with this cartoon that's also provocative in terms of political identity. And then I stop here, provoking a little bit the discussion. Thank you very much.